Story: The Circle of Blood, Chapter 1. Whispers in the forest. Autumn of 1963 had swept over the small town of Willow Creek, North Dakota, with a chill that bit at the cheeks and painted the maples in blazing reds and yellows. The air carried the scent of damp earth and burning leaves, and on the outskirts of town, where the forest began, there was a silence that felt unnatural, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Willow Creek was a sleepy place, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, where church bells marked the passage of time and secrets rarely survived past Sunday service. But something had changed. Something dark had begun to stir on the edges of the town, and it started with whispers. Ruth Harper, a 28-year-old librarian whose glasses always slid down her nose, had never been one to seek adventure. She was content with her books, her routines, and the safe rhythm of her life. But that evening, as she rode her bike home from the library along the narrow gravel road that cut through the forest, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. There was something in the air, a feeling of being watched. She paused at a bend, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly air, and listened. There it was again, a low, singing sound, like a choir of voices carrying words she could not make out. It came from deep in the forest, beyond the crooked pines and thick underbrush. She should have kept cycling, she should have ignored it, but curiosity, the stubborn spark that had always driven her to dig deeper into books, took over. Ruth left her bike at the roadside and walked cautiously toward the sound, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The further she went, the clearer the voices became. They were no longer just murmurs. They formed words, a rhythmic chant that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The blood calls, the circle binds, repeated over and over like a prayer or a spell. She stopped at a clearing, hidden behind a wall of bushes. Through the branches she saw them, a dozen figures in white hoods, their faces hidden, gathered around a blazing fire. In the center stood a woman, older, with silver-gray hair cascading in waves over her shoulders. Her voice was low but powerful, as if speaking directly to the forest itself. Ruth could not hear everything, but words like sacrifice and purification cut through the air like knives. On the ground in front of the woman lay something that looked like a pile of cloth, but as the firelight flickered over it, Ruth realized with icy horror that it was a body. A young man, pale and motionless, eyes staring blankly up at the night sky. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure they would hear it. She stepped back, a twig snapped under her foot, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The fire flared, and for a moment, the older woman's gaze met Ruth's. Her eyes were like glowing coals, filled with an intensity that froze Ruth to ice. Then the woman looked away, and the chorus of voices rose again, as if nothing had happened. Ruth ran. She ran until her lungs burned, and her legs gave way beneath her. Only when she was back at her bike and pedaling home did she dare to breathe again. But the image of the dead body and the white hoods burned in her mind. When she locked the door to her small house on Maple Street, she could not shake the feeling that something had seen her and that it would not forget her. The next day, Willow Creek appeared normal on the surface. The scent of coffee drifted from Maggie's diner, and men at the town's only gas station discussed baseball over greasy rags. But Ruth could not help noticing small things. An elderly man casting a suspicious glance at her as she walked by, a group of women falling silent when she entered the grocery store. It was as if the town had a secret and she was no longer part of it. At the library, she tried to focus on sorting returned books, but her mind wandered back to the night before. Who was the dead man? Why had no one reported him missing? And what was the group that had gathered in the forest? She decided to do what she did best: research. In the library archives, among dusty newspaper clippings and old maps, she began to dig. There was little to go on, but a name appeared in a 1958 article, a brief notice about a group calling themselves the Circle of Eternal Light. They had purchased an old farm on the outskirts of Willow Creek, but the article gave no details, only that they kept to themselves and locals called them strange. Ruth's search was interrupted by a knock at the library door. It was Sheriff Tom Carver, a man in his 40s with deep wrinkles and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had always been friendly to Ruth, but something about his posture today made her nervous. "Hi, Ruth," he said, leaning against the counter. "Heard you were out late last night. Everything okay?" Her heart skipped a beat. How could he know? She forced a smile. "Just a night walk, Sheriff, nothing special." He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "The forest isn't a place to be after dark. Strange things happen out there." His gaze drilled into her, and for a moment it felt like he could see right through her. Then he turned and left, but not before throwing one last glance over his shoulder. That night, Ruth could not sleep. Every creak in the house made her flinch, and when she finally did drift off, she dreamed of the fire, the white hoods, and the older woman's eyes. She awoke to the sound of sirens. She ran to the window and saw the sheriff's car speeding past, followed by an ambulance. Her heart sank. Something had happened. By morning, the news spread like wildfire. A body had been found by the river, not far from the clearing where Ruth had seen the ceremony. It was Mary Peterson, a 19-year-old girl who worked at the town bakery. She had been stabbed, and according to rumors, her body bore strange symbols carved into her skin. Ruth felt a cold sweat break out. She remembered the chant from the night before, "The blood calls, the circle binds." Was it a coincidence or something more? She could not stay away. Against her better judgment, she biked back to the forest, to the clearing. It was empty now, the fire extinguished, but the ground was trampled, and in the center lay a circle of stones, as if marking the site of something important. Ruth bent down and saw something glinting in the grass, a small silver locket, engraved with a symbol resembling a spiral with an eye in the center. She slipped it into her pocket, unsure what to do with it. As she turned, she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart raced, but it was only Danny Sullivan, a teenager who worked as a grocery store runner. He looked pale, his eyes darting. "What are you doing here, Ruth?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I just looking," she said, but she noticed he was holding something in his hand, a knife small but sharp. He saw her glance and quickly tucked it away. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "It's not safe." Before she could respond, he turned and ran into the forest. Ruth stood there, the locket heavy in her pocket. She knew she had stumbled upon something big, something dangerous. And she knew she could not leave it alone. Over the following days, tension in Willow Creek grew. Another body was found, this time an older man, a hermit who lived in a cabin at the forest's edge. His death was no accident. His throat had been cut, and the same symbols as on Mary's body were carved into his chest. Sheriff Carver called a town meeting, but his assurances that everything is under control rang hollow. People began locking their doors, and rumors of a cult began to spread. Some said they were devil worshippers, others that they were fanatics believing in a new world order. Ruth listened to everything, but said nothing about what she had seen in the forest. Not yet. She began following clues on her own. The locket led her to an antique dealer in a neighboring town, who said the symbol was linked to an old, forgotten religion, something about an eternal light that demanded sacrifices to maintain balance in the world. He was vague, but his eyes were fearful as he begged her not to dig deeper. But Ruth could not stop. She began noticing patterns, people disappearing from town, small details that didn't add up. Danny Sullivan, for example, had stopped coming to work. When she asked around, his mother said he had gone away, but her voice trembled and she avoided Ruth's gaze. One night, as Ruth sat at her kitchen table going over her notes, there was a knock at the door. She opened it carefully and found a note on the steps, written in a looping hand. "Stop digging or become part of the circle." Her hands shook as she read the words, but instead of scaring her, they ignited a fire within her. She would not back down. A week later came the turning point. Ruth had begun mapping the cult members based on what she had seen and heard. She suspected several townspeople were involved, including one of the town's priests, Father Malone, who always preached about sin and purification. She had seen him leaving the church late at night, always heading toward the forest. She decided to follow him. It was a foggy evening, and the moon cast a weak light over the forest. Ruth kept her distance, her steps silent on the damp ground. Father Malone walked briskly, as if with purpose. He led her to an old barn hidden behind thick trees. Through a cracked window, she saw the glow of torches and heard the voices again, the same chant, the same rhythm. But this time it was different. It was not just a ceremony, it was an execution. Danny Sullivan lay bound on the floor, his face bloody, eyes wide with terror. The older woman, whom Ruth now suspected was the cult leader, held a knife above him. "The blood must flow," she said, and the chorus around her echoed her words. Ruth could not just stand there. She ran back to town, legs trembling with exhaustion and fear, and knocked on Sheriff Carver's door. She told him everything: the clearing, the ceremony, the murders, the barn. For the first time, she saw something other than suspicion in his eyes. He nodded, called his men, and gathered a group of armed officers. When they stormed the barn, the scene was chaotic. The cult members tried to flee, but the sheriff's men were faster. Gunfire echoed through the night, and Ruth stood aside, heart pounding, as she saw the older woman captured. Danny was still alive, though barely. He was carried out on a stretcher, his eyes meeting Ruth's for a moment, filled with a mix of gratitude and shame. But when the police searched the barn, they found something that made Ruth's blood run cold. On the walls, carved into the wood, were names, dozens of names, including her own, and beneath her name were the words, "Next Victim." The Circle of Blood, Chapter 2, traces in the ash the morning after the raid on the barn. Willow Creek lay under a blanket of mist, as if the town itself were trying to hide its secrets. Ruth Harper hadn't slept. The image of her name, carved into the barn wall among dozens of others, burned itself into her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. She sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of her, staring at the silver medallion she had found in the clearing. The spiral-shaped symbol with an eye at its center seemed to pulse in the dim light of her kitchen lamp, as if it were alive. She had tried to rationalize everything. Perhaps it was just a threat, a scare tactic. But the feeling of being hunted, of something invisible following her, was impossible to shake. The raid had shaken the town. Sheriff Tom Carver had arrested 6 people, including the elderly woman, identified as Esther Marrow, a widow who had moved to Willow Creek a decade ago. The local paper, the Willow Gazette, called the event a tragic cult story, but the details were vague. Esther and her followers refused to speak, and Danny Sullivan, who had barely survived, lay in the hospital in the neighboring town of Bismarck, too weak to be interrogated. But what worried Ruth most was what the sheriff didn't say. During the town meeting the day after the raid, he had brushed off questions about the symbols on the victims' bodies and said the investigation was under control. His eyes had flickered, just as they had when he asked about her evening walk. Ruth couldn't help but wonder, did he know more than he let on? She decided to take action. If the police wouldn't provide answers, she would find them herself. She put on a thick wool sweater, tucked the medallion into her pocket, and headed to the library. There, among shelves of dusty books and yellowed newspaper clippings, she felt safe, or as safe as one could feel knowing their name was on a killer's list. She began digging deeper into the Circle of the Eternal Light, the cult mentioned in an old 1958 article. But the archives were frustratingly empty. The only clue was a brief note about the farm they had purchased, Blackthorn Farm, a remote property on the edge of the woods, abandoned since the Depression. No one had seen it in years, but rumors said it was haunted, or worse. Ruth's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the library door opening. It was Clara Monroe, a retired teacher who often borrowed romance novels. But today, Clara looked different. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, and her hands trembled as she placed a book on the counter. "Ruth," Clara said quietly, as if afraid of being overheard. "You were there, weren't you? In the woods?" Ruth froze. "What do you mean, Clara?" "Stop pretending," Clara hissed, glancing over her shoulder. "People are talking. They say you saw something and that you spoke to the sheriff. Be careful, Ruth. There are eyes everywhere." Before Ruth could respond, Clara turned and hurried out, leaving the book on the counter. Ruth picked it up gently, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights, and noticed a piece of paper sticking out between the pages. She opened it and found a handwritten note, "Blackthorn Farm, midnight, come alone." Her pulse quickened. Was it a trap? Or someone trying to help her? She tucked the note into her pocket next to the medallion, feeling a mix of fear and determination. She couldn't turn back now. That evening, while the town slept under a starry sky, Ruth prepared herself. She took a flashlight, a notebook, and after some hesitation, a kitchen knife, which she hid in her bag. Blackthorn Farm was an hour's bike ride away, along an overgrown path rarely used anymore. As she approached the location, the air grew heavier, as if the forest itself were trying to hold her back. The farm loomed in the darkness, a dilapidated house with broken windows and a barn leaning menacingly to one side. It was quiet, too quiet, and Ruth's own breath echoed in her ears. She crept to the house's porch, the flashlight beam sweeping over cracked floorboards and cobwebs. The door was ajar, and when she pushed it open, the hinges creaked like a warning scream. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the smell of mold and something sour, metallic. Blood. Her stomach churned, but she pressed on, driven by a stubbornness she didn't fully understand. In the living room, she found signs of life: candle stubs, empty wine bottles, and a pile of papers scattered across a table. She shone the flashlight on them and saw maps, hand-drawn symbols, and lists of names. Her own name was there again, underlined in red ink. But it wasn't that which made her heart stop. At the bottom of a page were the words, "The first circle is broken. The second begins at the next new moon." Below the words was a date: in 3 days. A sound behind her made her spin around. In the doorway stood a figure, face hidden in shadows. Ruth's hand flew to the knife in her bag, but before she could draw it, the figure stepped into the light. It was Clara. "You came," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I knew you would." "Clara, what is this?" Ruth held up the note. "Who are you with? Are you one of them?" Clara shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "No, Ruth, I'm not with them, but I know things. My brother, he was in the circle many years ago. He tried to leave and they killed him. I've tried to warn people, but no one listens. They are everywhere, in the church, in the town hall, even in the police." Ruth's mind raced. "Sheriff Carver," Clara nodded. "Not sure, but he's protected them before. Esther Marrow isn't the leader, Ruth. She's just a priestess. The real power lies elsewhere, higher up." Before Ruth could ask more, the sound of tires on gravel came from outside. Clara grabbed Ruth's arm. "We have to hide, now." They dove behind an old sofa just as the door was thrown open. 2 men entered, their voices low but clear. Ruth recognized one of them, Father Malone, the priest. The other voice was deeper, unknown, but filled with authority. "She was here," Father Malone said. "Her bike is outside." "Good," the other man replied. "Let her dig. She will lead us to what we need." Ruth's heart pounded so hard she was sure they could hear it. Clara grabbed her hand, nails digging into her skin. When the men finally left the room, Ruth and Clara slipped out a back door, running through the woods until they reached Ruth's bike. Clara refused to return to town. "I'm not safe anymore," she whispered before disappearing into the darkness. Back in her house, Ruth locked the door and drew the curtains. She couldn't trust anyone now, not the sheriff, not the priest, maybe not even Clara. She opened her notebook and began writing down everything she had seen: the maps, the names, the date of the new moon. She remembered the antique dealer's words about the old religion, about sacrifices to maintain balance. But what balance? And why was her name so important? The next day she tried to live normally, but the town felt like a trap. Everywhere she saw suspicious glances, heard whispers that fell silent when she approached. At the library, she noticed someone had been there. Her archive box of clippings was disturbed, and a book on occult symbols was missing. Walking home that evening, she saw a car following her slowly at a distance. Her hands shook as she locked the door. That night, she dreamed of the clearing again, but this time she was lying on the ground, surrounded by white hoods. Esther Marrow's voice echoed, "The blood calls." She woke with a start, sweaty and breathless. On the kitchen table lay the medallion, but now it was open. Inside was a small yellowed note with a name, Abigail Harper. Her mother, who had died when Ruth was a child. Her heart stopped. What did the cult have to do with her family? She decided to confront Sheriff Carver. If he was involved, she would make him reveal something. She went to the sheriff's office early in the morning, but found it empty. On his desk lay a map of the woods with Blackthorn Farm marked. Beside the map was a list of names, the same names from the barn, including her own. But a new name had been added, Danny Sullivan, crossed out in red ink. Ruth's stomach turned. Danny was no longer in the hospital. She called Bismarck and confirmed that he had been discharged the day before, despite his condition. She knew what that meant. The cult had reached him. Driven by anger and fear, Ruth went to the hospital in Bismarck to get answers. There, she met a young nurse, Jenny, who had seen Danny last. Jenny was nervous, but after some persuasion, she revealed that a man in clerical clothing had taken Danny, claiming to be his uncle. Ruth knew it was Father Malone. She returned to Willow Creek and began planning. The new moon was only 2 days away, and if Clara was right, the cult hadn't stopped, they had just gone underground. Ruth began following Father Malone, careful not to be seen. He led her to an abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a place unused for decades. Through a window, she saw him light candles and place objects on an altar: a knife, a bowl, and something that looked like an old book. Ruth crept closer, but a hand grabbed her from behind. She gasped, but when she turned, she saw Clara again. "You can't go in there," Clara hissed. "They're waiting for you." "I have to know," Ruth said. "If my mother was involved, I have to understand." Clara shook her head. "Your mother tried to stop them, Ruth. That's why she died. They call it a sacrifice, but it's murder. And now they want you." Before Ruth could respond, voices came from inside the church. Clara pulled her behind a gravestone, and they saw Father Malone and the other man from the barn emerge. They carried something heavy, wrapped in cloth. Ruth's heart sank. She knew what it was: a body. Ruth followed them at a distance, back to Blackthorn Farm. There, in a cellar beneath the barn, she found the evidence she had been seeking: a hidden chamber filled with ritual objects, blood-stained clothing, and a wall covered in symbols. But what scared her most was an old diary written by Esther Marrow. It described the Circle as an ancient order, obsessed with the belief that certain people's blood, the chosen, could open a gateway to something they called the eternal light. Ruth's mother had been one of the chosen, and now Ruth was too. She grabbed the diary and ran, but as she reached the forest, she heard footsteps behind her. Father Malone stood there, his eyes cold. "You should have listened, Ruth," he said. "Now it's too late." She ran, branches whipping against her face, until she reached the town. She knocked on Sheriff Carver's door, diary in hand, and told him everything. For the first time, he seemed shaken. He called for backup from Bismarck, and that night, the police raided the church and Blackthorn Farm. Father Malone was arrested, but the other man, the one with the deep voice, was gone. When the new moon rose over Willow Creek, the cult seemed defeated, but Ruth knew better. The diary mentioned a highest circle, a group ruling from the shadows. Her name was still on the list, and as she sat in her house, diary hidden under a floorboard, she heard a faint knocking at the door. She opened it, but no one was there. On the doorstep lay a new medallion, identical to the first, but with a new inscription: "The second circle begins." The Circle of Blood, Chapter 3. The legacy of Fire Autumn in Willow Creek had grown colder, as if winter had arrived early to choke the town in frost. Ruth Harper sat at her kitchen table, the new medallion lying before her like a poisonous object she dared not touch. The inscription, "The second circle begins," echoed in her mind like a clock counting down to something inevitable. The diary she had stolen from Blackthorn Farm lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard, but its contents haunted her. The words about the chosen ones, about blood opening a gateway to the eternal light, and worst of all, her mother, Abigail Harper, as one of the cult's victims. Or was she something more? Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about her mother was the key to everything, and that this truth could cost her life. The raid on the church and Blackthorn Farm had shaken Willow Creek, but instead of relief, it left a bitter aftertaste. Father Malone sat behind bars, refusing to speak, his eyes cold and unyielding during interrogations. Esther Marrow and the other captured cult members were equally silent, as if waiting for something or someone. Sheriff Tom Carver had increased patrols in town, but his assurances that the danger was over rang hollow. Ruth had seen the map on his desk, her name underlined, and she could not trust him, not when Clara Monroe's warning that the cult had tentacles in City Hall and even the police still rang in her ears. The town itself felt like a trap. Neighbors who once smiled at Ruth now cast suspicious glances, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Maggie's diner, where she used to grab a coffee after work, went silent when she entered, as if her presence was a disruption. Even the library, her sanctuary, felt unsafe. Someone had moved her things again, and another book on occult rites had vanished from the shelves. Ruth began to wonder if she was paranoid or if she was truly being hunted. But she could not stop digging. The diary had given her a new lead, a reference to a place called the Chamber of Fire, a sacred site for the cult, hidden somewhere near Willow Creek. Esther Marrow's notes described it as a cave or cellar where the first rituals were performed over a century ago. If Ruth could find it, perhaps she could understand what the cult planned and why her mother had been so important to them. Ruth began her search at the library, digging through old maps of Willow Creek and its surroundings. She found references to caves in the mountains north of town, but they were vague, written by 19th-century settlers who warned of evil places where people disappeared. A map from 1874 marked a location called Hollow Ridge, with a note about a cave the locals avoided. It was not much, but it was a start. She decided to contact Clara again. If anyone knew more about the cult's history, it was her. But when Ruth knocked on Clara's door, she was met with silence. The house looked abandoned, the curtains drawn, and a pile of newspapers lay on the steps. A neighbor, an older man named Harold, watched her from his porch. "Clara's gone," he said, his voice low. "Saw her packing a bag a couple of days ago, said she was going to relatives in Fargo." But he hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. She looked scared, Ruth, like she was running from something. Ruth's stomach tightened. Clara had warned her about the cult, and now she was gone. Was it a coincidence, or had the cult silenced her? She thanked Harold and left, but the feeling of being watched followed her all the way back to the library. That evening, as she reviewed the diary's notes, she heard a faint scraping at the window. Her heart raced as she drew back the curtain. Nothing was there, except a small stone on the windowsill, engraved with the same spiral symbol as the medallion. Someone had been there, right outside her house. She locked every door and window, but sleep eluded her. Every creak in the old house sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whisper. The next morning, Ruth decided to head to Hollow Ridge. She could not wait any longer. If the cult planned something for the new moon, now only a day away, time was running out. She packed a backpack with a flashlight, rope, a map, and a kitchen knife, which now felt like her only protection. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even Betty, the library's other staff member, who had begun asking too many questions about Ruth's pale face and nervous glances. The road to Hollow Ridge was desolate, a narrow path winding up the steep hills north of Willow Creek. Fog hung thick, and the trees stood like silent sentinels in the forest. Ruth's breath formed clouds in the cold air, and her heart pounded with both exertion and fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a trap, but the thought of her mother, Abigail, who may have tried to stop the cult, drove her onward. Hollow Ridge was a barren place, with cliffs rising like ancient ruins. After an hour of hiking, she found the entrance to a cave, half hidden behind vines and moss. It was narrow, and a cold wind swept out from the darkness, as if the cave itself were breathing. Ruth turned on her flashlight and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing against the damp walls. Inside, she found signs of human presence, carved symbols on the walls, remnants of candles, and a circle of stones in the center of a large chamber. This was the Chamber of Fire, just as the diary had described. In the center of the circle lay an old wooden box, covered in dust and cobwebs. Ruth opened it carefully and found a bundle of letters written in her mother's handwriting. Her heart pounded as she read the first one. Abigail had been a member of the circle as a young woman, but realized their rites were not spiritual but evil. She had tried to escape, but the cult leader, someone only called the Keeper, had marked her as a target. The letters described her fear that Ruth, her daughter, would be next in line. One letter ended with the words, "If I do not survive, hide, Ruth. They will never stop hunting you." Tears strung Ruth's eyes, But before she could read further, a sound came from deeper in the cave, a low, chanting sound, like whispers in the forest. She hid behind a rock just as a group of figures in white hoods entered the chamber. They were not Esther Marrow or Father Malone. These faces were new, but their voices carried the same chant. The blood calls, the circle binds. At the front walked a man with a deep voice, the same Ruth had heard in the barn. He wore a robe adorned with golden embroidery, and his presence radiated authority, making the air feel heavy. "She is here," he said, his voice like thunder. "I can feel it. Her blood is the key." Ruth's breath caught. She now understood. Her mother's blood, and now her own, were part of a ritual the cult believed would grant them power, perhaps even supernatural power. She gripped her knife tighter, but before she could act, another sound came, sirens echoing through the forest. Sheriff Carver and his men stormed into the cave, weapons drawn. Gunfire erupted, and Ruth threw herself to the ground as chaos exploded around her. When the dust settled, several cult members were captured, but the golden-embroidered man, the keeper, was gone, as if he had melted into the cave walls. Sheriff Carver found Ruth hiding behind the rock and helped her out. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, but his eyes avoided hers, and she couldn't shake the feeling he was hiding something. Back in Willow Creek, Ruth tried to piece together what she had learned. Her mother's letters confirmed that Abigail had tried to stop the cult, but also that the circle was much older and larger than anyone had realized. The keeper, who had escaped capture, was the key, but his identity remained a mystery. Ruth hid the letters and the diary in her house, but she knew her safety was only temporary. That night, she dreamed of the cave, of her mother standing in the firelight, whispering, "Run, Ruth. They will always find you." When she woke, a new note lay on her kitchen table, despite the doors being locked. The words were simple but chilling. "The second circle is not broken. The third awaits." Outside, a car started and drove off into the darkness, its lights disappearing into the fog. The Circle of Blood, Chapter 4. The fall of the circle winter had begun to bite at Willow Creek, and the frost painted the windows with crystal patterns that reminded Ruth Harper of the spiral symbols that haunted her life. The latest note, "The second circle is not broken. The third awaits," lay on her kitchen table as a constant reminder that time was running out. Her mother Abigail's diary and letters were hidden beneath the floorboard, but their contents burned in her mind. The Circle of Eternal Light was no ordinary cult. They were an ancient order, obsessed with a ritual that required the blood of the chosen to, according to their belief, open a gateway to something they called the Eternal Light. And Ruth was next in line. The town felt like a cage. After the events in the Chamber of Fire, Sheriff Tom Carver had increased patrols, but his presence gave Ruth no comfort. His evasive glances and the vagueness surrounding the keeper, the cult's mysterious leader who had vanished without a trace, made her certain he was either involved or powerless against the cult's influence. Clara Monroe was still missing, and rumors said she had fled to Fargo, but Ruth feared the worst. Every closed door, every whisper that fell silent as she passed, reinforced the feeling that Willow Creek was no longer her home. But Ruth was not one to give up. Her mother's letters had revealed that Abigail had tried to stop the cult, and now it was Ruth's turn. She had a plan, but it was dangerous, perhaps suicidal. The diary mentioned a final ritual, scheduled for the upcoming full moon, to take place at a location called the Heart of Light. If Ruth could find this place and uncover the cult's plans before they acted, maybe she could stop them for good, or at least buy time to understand who the keeper was and what he wanted with her. Ruth began by mapping out clues from the diary and letters. Abigail had written of a place where fire was born, a secret chamber beneath the city's oldest building, Willow Creek's first church, built in 1847 and abandoned since the turn of the century. It lay on the outskirts of town, hidden among thickets and decay, and no one went there anymore. Local legends said the church was cursed, that anyone who entered never came out. Ruth had ignored such stories as a child, but now they felt like warnings. She couldn't go to the sheriff. If he was involved, he would stop her, or worse. Instead, she turned to an unexpected ally, Jenny, the nurse from Bismarck who had seen Danny Sullivan taken by Father Malone. Jenny had called Ruth the day after the events in the cave, worried and full of guilt. "I should have said something sooner," she had said, "but I was afraid." Ruth persuaded her to help, and Jenny agreed to accompany her to the church. "If they did something to Danny," Jenny said, her voice hard, "they won't get away with it." That evening, as the full moon cast a silver-blue light over Willow Creek, Ruth and Jenny made their way to the abandoned church. They carried flashlights, ropes, and Ruth's kitchen knife, which now felt pathetically inadequate against the threat they faced. The church loomed in the darkness, its broken spires clawing at the sky. The door was locked, but Ruth found a loose board in a wall and they slipped inside. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The pews were smashed, and the altar stood empty, except for a stained cloth, darkened with what looked like blood. Ruth's flashlight swept over the walls, revealing symbols, the same spiral with an eye as on the medallion. Jenny grabbed her arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ruth listened. A faint, singing sound came from the floor beneath them. She remembered the diary. The heart of light lay under the church. They found a hidden hatch behind the altar, its hinges rusted but still functional. When they opened it, a staircase descended into darkness. The air that rose was cold and carried a faint scent of smoke and blood. "We should get help," Jenny said, her voice trembling. "There's no time," Ruth replied. "If they're down there, they're doing it now." They went down, the steps creaking under their feet. The staircase led to a large chamber, lit by torches that cast flickering shadows on the walls. In the center stood a circle of stones, and around it, a dozen figures in white hoods. At the head stood the keeper, his gold-embroidered robe gleaming in the firelight. On the floor lay a young woman, bound and unconscious. Ruth recognized her. It was Betty, her colleague from the library. The chant began, the same words that had haunted Ruth for weeks. "Blood calls, the circle binds." The keeper held a knife, its blade catching the light like a deadly star. Ruth's heart pounded, but she couldn't just stand and watch. She turned to Jenny. "Go get the sheriff, now." Jenny hesitated, then ran up the stairs. Ruth hid behind a pillar, her hand around the knife in her bag. She knew she couldn't take them on alone, but if she could delay them until Jenny returned with help, maybe Betty could be saved. The keeper raised the knife, but before he could strike, Ruth threw a stone at one of the torches. It fell to the floor, and the fire spread quickly across the dry wooden floor. Chaos erupted. The cult members screamed, and the keeper turned toward the noise, his eyes glowing like coals. "She's here," he roared. Ruth ran, but one of the hoods grabbed her and threw her to the ground. The knife flew from her hand, and she stared up at the keeper's face. For the first time, she saw him clearly, a man in his 60s, with sharp features and eyes burning with fanaticism. "You are Abigail's daughter," he said, his voice low but triumphant. "Your blood will complete what we began." Before he could do more, sirens sounded outside. The chamber door burst open, and Sheriff Carver stormed in with a dozen officers from Bismarck. Gunfire echoed, and Ruth dove to avoid the bullets. The keeper tried to flee through a side passage, but one officer shot him in the leg. The cult members surrendered without a fight, their chants silenced in the chaos. Ruth crawled to Betty, who was still alive, though barely. She cut the ropes and held her as paramedics took over. Sheriff Carver approached Ruth, his face tense. "You have no idea what you've set in motion," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only fatigue. As the full moon faded over Willow Creek, the church was surrounded by police cars and curious journalists. The keeper, identified as Samuel Kane, a former professor of occult studies, was taken away in handcuffs. He said nothing, but his gaze met Ruth's as he passed, and a smile crossed his lips, as if he knew something she did not. Esther Marrow, Father Malone, and the other arrested cult members refused to speak, but the evidence in the church, bloodstained knives, ritual objects, and a list of future victims was enough to send them to prison. Betty survived, but remembered nothing of what had happened. Danny Sullivan, however, was never found, and Ruth feared he was lost forever. But it was not over. As Ruth went through the diary one last time, she found a page she had missed, a map leading to a place outside Willow Creek, marked with the words. The third circle, below the map, was a sentence: "The keeper is only a servant. The true power still sleeps. Ruth sat in her house, windows locked, curtains drawn. She had stopped the cult, but the cost was high. Clara was still missing, the sheriff's loyalty was uncertain, and the feeling of being hunted had not vanished. On her kitchen table lay the first medallion, the one she had found in the glade. When she opened it, she found a new inscription, engraved with a precision that made her shiver. "You cannot escape the light." Outside, the wind whistled, but in its murmur, Ruth thought she heard whispers, the same chant, the same words. The circle might have been broken, but a new one awaited, and she knew she could not stop fighting. Epilogue. Winter had left Willow Creek, but the town no longer felt alive. Ruth Harper stood at her window, medallion heavy in her hand, staring out over the frosty streets. She had survived, but the price had been high. Friends were missing, enemies lurked in the shadows, and the truth about the circle of eternal light was far from revealed. On the table before her lay the diary, the map to the third circle, and another medallion with the inscription, "You cannot escape the light." Her heart pounded, but Ruth knew the fight would never end. The circle waited, and somewhere in the darkness, those who had always been in control waited. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "If they think I'm giving up, they're wrong." For in Willow Creek, as in all towns of secrets, the whispers continue, and the circle of blood has only just begun.